So there's a pretty popular video about the death of TF2's art style by this dude named FUNKe. It's got over 3 million views, he's got 1 million subs, and from the time it was released in 2017 to the present day, a lot of what he talks about is shockingly relevant even now. It's a great introduction of the blatant truth that TF2's art style is buried 60 feet deep. Needless to say, by the nature of its popularity, it is a consistently resurging origin point for the broad discussion regarding TF2's art style. This analysis isn't just about the video in particular, but also how FUNKe has walked back on it, to what extent he thinks he's walked back versus what extent he really has, and just how much that's impacted the conversation as a result of the influence a man in his position naturally has. I will also be analyzing some slightly philosophical concepts throughout that are very much relevant for this conversation to hold the meaning anyone thinks it does. For folks that agree or disagree with any position mentioned, establishing frameworks and core paradigms are important for the truth to be revealed. If you're wondering why talk about death of an art style now, it's because not only has FUNKe made a point to publicly walk the video and its points back, but has even gone as far as to personally debate with me under one of my streams when I spoke my opinion about this previously. So, allow me to quickly go through the video FUNKe has now walked back on, so we can have a good understanding of the fallout from said retractions. The video itself outlines several things. Firstly, he has quit TF2 trading at the time of upload due to not wanting to further the damaging of TF2's art style. Secondly, he outlines what type of cosmetics work for TF2 versus what doesn't with a simple comparison. Note that this isn't his opinion, he's just pointing to the objectively changed standards. The counterfeit billycock was added in 2011, the same year as the Robin Walker interview he cites in the intro to the video. It's a humorous play on the pre-existing gag that Spy's disguises are just a piece of cardboard strapped to his head, with the face of the class he's disguising as printed on it. It's a top hat with the disguise, so to speak, of a bowler hat. Absurd? Yes, but as FUNKe outlines, not necessarily over the top. It does reflect the class wearing it, at least in theme, and either hat, top or bowler, certainly would have existed for a character of Spy's disposition back in the time period of the game. Compare this, as FUNKe does, to a massive banana head that surely gives away location depending on certain maps and serves no purpose other than to be a post-ironic, laugh because it's wacky excuse for a hat. There is nothing thematically, tonally, or even conceptually interesting about this. This cosmetic exists purely for the paints and the money from keys and trading, as far as Valve is concerned. For the brainwashed fan, this hat exists to be nothing more than a meme, not a joke with substance to tie back to, like the counterfeit billycock, but, as I said, a statement piece to post irony. It's not just ironic, since irony is defined as what is more so contextually humorous, like how the Reliable Excavation Demolition Crew is the defending team, while the Builders League United is the team that drops a bomb in Red's buildings. This doesn't even exist to be humorously contrarian in the same sense as TF2's themings and settings. It exists to muddy the very ideas of sincere effort and irony within and without context of the game. Now, what I've just described isn't what FUNKe says word for word, but this is the standard he was pointing to, whether he realized it at the time or not. To point out that there is a sincere difference between a hat for Spy that riffs off his in-game mechanics and a wearable banana is to point out that there are standards that exist independent of not only player intention and interpretation, but also developer intention and interpretation. The game has, baked within itself, an identity that exists outside of opinion as to what said identity is. The banana ignores this. Now, this isn't to say that TF2 can't be absurd without context. FUNKe points this out by notating that there are heel rays and human teleportation. This is where the audience, so to speak, is expected to suspend their disbelief for the sake of the experience's internal coherency. However, as he noted with his hat comparison, there is a point where absurdity goes over the top. His next primary example are the Apple earphones that were created as a promotional item for the game's official support on macOS. This was in 2010. This makes no sense in universe and serves as nothing more than a cultural tie-in with the popularity of Apple products and the growing popularity of TF2, which would pretty much explode just a year later when the game went free to play. Now, is that a bad thing? Is it bad for TF2 to tie into the cultural relevances of its time period? For that matter, is it bad for any game to do that? Well, unless the game is specifically themed and set in the cultural relevance of the time in which it came out, the answer is yes, it is a bad thing. This is not to say that the creative output from the community cannot be separate. I was recently watching the 2 Dead TF2 servers videos from Redline, and in them I noticed him mention a lot of maps that were insanely popular back in the time periods that they reference, everything from Mario Kart DS to My Little Pony themings and so on. That's fine for the customized experience that player-hosted servers provide. Those servers are a window into the time period of the game's heyday, when there were enough culturally relevant experiences adjacent to TF2 that to combine them just worked for that time. Note, however, that I said this is acceptable for the custom experience. TF2 has been designed from the outset to be customizable by the players only insofar as player-hosted servers allow. This lends longevity to the game in terms of creativity, as well as allowing communities to form around said creativity. The base game, as its own operation, runs on a specific list of responsibilities. It can't just be a sandbox, that's what Gary's mod is. So what the game needs to uphold is an experience that maintains enough internal cohesion and consistency with itself to get players interested, while also providing enough dynamic team opportunities and scenarios that keep players interested. This was expanded into the realm of weapon side grades, new game modes, and baked-in self-customization through hats. And for as debatable as all of these choices were, insofar as their contribution to the game's art style, all of what I've described as expansions from the base game still remained just consistent enough to where nobody really batted an eye. Fast forward to 2017, and FUNKe is making a video essentially challenging this baked-in customization paradigm with a simple question. How does this benefit TF2? For that matter, what purpose does it serve beyond just looking thematically out of place? Why is this here? These are perfectly reasonable questions to ask, as the game's core still points toward the standards of its creators. Part of the reason TF2 was enticing enough in the first place for a lot of people was because its internal coherency at base gave people the impression that this world, cartoonish though it was by comparison to its contemporaries of the FPS world at the time, made sense for itself. It was goofy, yes, but it worked because the game could take itself just seriously enough to where it helped the game feel unique. Is it goofy for a Boston baseball runt to run around with a child's baseball bat? Is it absurd for invisibility and automated weaponry to exist in the 1960s? Is it ridiculous for the location of these fights to take place in the Mojave Desert, of all places? Absolutely. And yet, the game takes itself just seriously enough to where the suspense of disbelief is acceptable to hold within oneself, because the game can very efficiently sell the player on the ideal that, in spite of its outward appearance, the mechanics, team dynamics, and individual class diversity for combat make for an incredibly enjoyable experience. Now, with all that in mind, how does the banana serve this? Frankly, no cosmetics serves these fundamental goals. They're frosting on an already frosted cake, but at least with the original intention of cosmetics to just stay within as hats and be simple in design, there was at least an argument to be made that this was simply the extra layers of frosting and icing that give the already well-designed cake just a little more detail. That's all well and nice, but by the time period when FUNKe made this video, and certainly by the Big 26, with the summer update that just recently released breaking the matchmaking system that also celebrated its 10-year anniversary of implementation into the game, something has gone quite wrong with all of this cosmetic art style stuff. FUNKe correctly points out that Valve has never exactly had good standards for what makes it into the game, regardless of who was in charge of the game, be it Robin or the Modern Fellows. He even notes that certain class-specific cosmetics were made all-class just because, and most egregiously, someone submitted a pyro-cosmetic redone for Sniper as a joke, and it got added into the game. A joke cosmetic made it into a video game with several thousand players playing each day, and that has a microeconomy circling around it that earns the developing company tens of millions of dollars a year. A joke cosmetic. FUNKe notes that item descriptions were ceased for seemingly no reason, which, as far as I'm concerned, was probably for the best if all we really were gonna get out of it was Scout being described as pedophilic. Don't know what the potted plant was smoking when it submitted that into the game, but keep that stuff as far away from me as possible, please. Crates and keys are nothing more than a gambling system, with rarity being incredibly artificial, considering that these are digital items that don't matter to anyone in the real world because their only purpose to anyone with an IQ above 64 is to make money through trading and the general marketplace. If it's of a rare variety, that's good news. If it's rare and unusual, forget about it. This artificial rarity also means that the rarest of the rare could be, just because they're digital items, literally anything the developers see fit. A lot of the time, the rare cosmetics wind up being the dumbest looking ones as far as the game's art style is concerned, but nobody cares because it's rare, which means there's money to be lost on gambling for it, I guess. Full sets never seem to make it into the game, which is a shame because the only purpose for certain cosmetics being created in the first place was for a cohesive project of the full set. It only makes sense most of the time with its complementary set, yet said sets don't make it in a lot of the time. FUNKe points this out quite correctly. FUNKe brings up unusuals next, which are easily the dumbest cosmetic decision added to TF2, and it's not even close. Full-bodied cosmetic sets are stupid and just lead to an even greater excuse to degrade the art style and only remaining consistent with oneself, but at least they could be used for good if they have to be there. What in the world is good about any of this insofar as the art style of the game? Not even the good ones make sense, and it's not even just cosmetics. It applies to weapons, and those weapons now have killstreak kits that make your eyes glow funny, and they shine a color contrary to what they could realistically, and it's just stupid. There's no other way to look at it. It's just stupid. FUNKe doesn't bring all of what I said up, but he points, again, to the principle that nothing about this makes sense. Unusuals shouldn't be in the game. Are they visually stimulating? Yeah, sure, but that doesn't matter. They shouldn't be in the game, and if you disagree, you're just wrong. To briefly add on to FUNKE's lightning round, paint colors are stupid because from the very beginning they weren't even handled to specifically lend themselves to the art style of the game. They couldn't even be handled better because to do so would just limit the colors to the palette of the game, which would be fine, but that would inevitably render the system obsolete because people wouldn't be able to just paint something whatever they wanted. This can and definitely does wreck player recognition in the heat of many games, which FUNKE very easily demonstrates by showing examples that can kinda be recognized, but also kinda not. With that being said, he also stipulated the hypothetical for a fresh install player, which would, they probably wouldn't really know what to think. There's also not enough color on a lot of cosmetics in the game nowadays, which can kinda be an excuse and kinda can't depending on context, but again, FUNKE is pointing to the principle that if you're going to have cosmetics in the game, make them still work for player distinction like the no cosmetic models already do. That standard is definitely not being held up by Valve at all. You know what else isn't being held up by Valve? The cosmetics on the player models, apparently, because FUNKE is right. Cosmetics clip a lot, and they still do that. I'm pretty sure my own cosmetics I got a while back still clip. Heck, my own thumbnail maker can't make certain cosmetics not clip into the models or other cosmetics, and he's a pro. Now, FUNKE does end the video by saying that he doesn't really mind if the art style is pushed a bit, with bugs being minimal and something like Pyro wearing a boot on his head not exactly hurting anyone. He does also distinguish that there's a pretty big difference between something mildly acceptable and something that looks like you took a crack map like Cyberpunk and made it into a player model. Contextual comedy aside, what FUNKE has illustrated through this whole video is that the standard of TF2's art style still exists independent of opinion, and he does allude to the thought that even he doesn't mind too terribly much so long as it's accomplished tastefully. As nice as that is, this is perhaps the only flaw in his video. For as much as his intro said that some things were objective and some things were subjective, this is pretty much the only genuinely subjective sentence in the entire video, and it's just to outline that he's not really the strictest about it, but it gets to a point where you wonder how far back you'd have to revert stuff for things to even make sense for the game again. Regardless of his own sentimentality, what his video has accomplished is a fairly brief, yet shockingly objective and very much accurate criticism of the state of TF2's art style. He never mentioned any of his criticisms as personal feelings, he actually just says that they're just problems through and through. This is pretty gutsy considering how easy it is to make some people whiny about that sort of phrasing, but he was right about basically everything he said. The principle, so to speak, of TF2's art style has not been upheld, and it's deteriorated to such an extent where the title Death of an Art Style is honestly the mild description of this mess we're currently living through. So overall, a very good video, definitely relevant for today, applying beyond cosmetics to even the very map design, though that was definitely true even back in 2017 too. With all this truth nukage, so to speak, why would this warrant a rediscussion? Well, FUNKe Boy over here is a pretty popular dude, so whatever he says in the TF2 world can send ripple effects across the conversation, and even directly inspire and influence it just because he jumped in. Fast forward to about 2 or 3 years ago, and FUNKe has, I kid you not, gone back on his video to a margin very much understated by the community and even himself. This comes in the form of a contribution to a forum thread that started as a discussion about the Emporium, their stranglehold on the TF2 cosmetics scene, and an overall lack of team recognition as a result of the damage done to the art style. The contents of this nuisance of a thread is not the subject of this video going forward, but among a great deal of crapping on Richter over time and Zesty Jesus because they commit the sin of being passionate about this subject, and frankly being right about the subject to a degree they do not get enough credit for, FUNKe was brought up as a YouTuber that contributed to the discussion. In fact, he was brought up as a direct reply to this post that just throws Richter under the bus for no reason. So, FUNKe responded with what reads purely as a capitulation to a disgruntled mob. I circled back around to liking weird and tacky loadouts because I just find them really objectively funny. Objectively funny? That doesn't make any sense at all. If FUNKe's preference is for grounded cosmetics, why would he need to start defending the cosmetics he very rightly pointed out were a problem? Heck, FUNKe criticized the system as a whole, and while his video was brief, there was an incredible deal of substance to glean from what he discussed. He pointed to the failure on players creating cosmetics and Valve for not upholding the standard the game had set upon release. Now he's arguing that TF2's design principles are so strong that even in extreme circumstances, it's rare for a player to struggle identifying a class or team alignment. This directly goes against what he pointed out in his video. And even if that was true, the point of his team recognition examples in his video is that the problem exists, or at least has the potential to exist. It doesn't matter if 99% of people don't paint their cosmetics in a fashion that destroys team recognition, in the way that FUNKe outlined. The problem still exists, and that's the crux of what FUNKe pointed towards, regardless of his intent to do so. Keep in mind this intent thing, because it gets pretty important from this point on. Like, alright, you got flanked by a pyro because you thought he was on your team. Laugh it off and move on. It's genuinely not a big deal. Isn't it? The reality is, FUNKe can't say this with any shred of personal honesty or integrity without first proving it. He very effortlessly proved it through his own video that this is actually a very big deal. Even outside of his video, I think the fact that the game is more colloquially known as a hat simulator is pretty damning evidence that this game isn't remembered as the genuine piece of art it started as. Was it even perfect when it started? No, but it was a heck of a lot more cohesive than right now. So if FUNKe is to go back on what he described, he needs some evidence toward the contrary of his video in a way that still makes sense, and even more sense than the video did and still does. How would we know if he does that? Well, he started interacting with folks in his comment section. He pinned a comment a couple years ago noticing that the video was getting popular again, and that he still agrees with it. So why did he say things contrary to his own points on that forum? Well, he clarifies that the TF2 of today is a result of Valve poorly planning things and intentionally being lenient with their art style restrictions for the sake of player expression. He seems to be forgetting that players also have a responsibility to make things becoming of the game they're essentially working for by making items to submit into it in the first place, like cosmetics, war paints, unusuals, and maps. But yes, Valve certainly is to blame for being exactly what the players of their games commonly expect by this point in history, a bunch of inept and lazy cruds. FUNKe says that he's upset by how people see his video and forget the second part. That being that Valve has intentionally lifted their own restrictions. This is genuinely irrelevant. In fact, it makes it worse that Valve has lifted their own restrictions, since that means the game has the potential free license to be whatever it wants. Just as a little note for you viewers, if you care even a little bit about the identity a piece of art that you love holds independent of anyone else's opinion, that should shock and rattle you. If it doesn't, you should be questioning your love for those things. Just saying. There are, however, 2 words in here, just 2, that effectively toxify the discussion in terms of its potential to maintain any shred of logical congruency. Player expression. What does it mean for a player to express themselves? As far as mechanics go in any video game, generally it means nothing. Players utilize the mechanics the game naturally provides to the best of their ability, assuming they're playing the game with the intent the game itself was designed for, which is completion, to whatever extent that means for the context of the game. For TF2, this would mean completing the objective of the game to whatever that entails for whatever team is being played on and what game mode is being played. So what would player expression mean in terms of cosmetics? And since this really is the root of the discussion, how would that contribute towards the death of TF2's art style? Player expression in this case would just be whatever you want to apply to your character, right? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Let's assume that all TF2 cosmetics adhere to the art style of the game. To apply a cosmetic, or if the game still has the 3 cosmetic system, a group of cosmetics, would be to distinguish yourself from everyone else. This player distinction is not the same as player expression as people presently understand it. Player distinction is simply the choice to look unique to yourself because you want to. Player expression, on the other hand, implies a deeper purpose. What does it mean to express yourself? In terms of facial expressions, they are used to communicate how someone feels non-verbally. To express something, then, is to make a statement about how you feel, what you think, and possibly even deeper things. So, if we're talking about player expression in a video game, we're talking really about what players choose to say about themselves and wear on their sleeves, so to speak, for all in this public game to see. When TF2 just had the first set of hats, you were either someone who had a hat for the class or you weren't. The hatted classes were distinct from the hatless players, so to speak, but that alone is not player expression. That is player distinction. Player expression requires a large variety to choose from to accurately construct an expression of oneself. In this sense, a vast number of items to customize oneself, like cosmetics, killstreak kits, war paints, weapon cosmetics, and even the HUD and graphics configuration for someone to use in gameplay. This is why, and I think I can say this safely, the pro-player expression crowd generally has either no opinion about the art style degradation, or are very negative towards the art style preservationists, so to speak. How could they accurately express themselves if they didn't have the variety the game now provides? Imagine just how stifling it would be if the game had cosmetic choices that only adhered to the game's art design. That's not broad enough of a spectrum for expression, after all. At a certain point, game developers have to make a choice. Do they design the game with this level of massive expression in mind, even to the point of potentially axing any art style that could be otherwise had, and just have the expression itself be the art style? Or do they design the game with a specific presentation in mind, and align everything after that point with that presentation as much as possible? For TF2, the latter was chosen, and the former was re-chosen, as if the choice was ever something they could go back to. Reality dictates differently. And before I hear anything in my comment section, no, this isn't my opinion, and no, this isn't up for debate. Truth exists irrespective of whether we as people like it or not in the moment, and the truth of this particular matter is that a choice was made. A choice that was not adhered to and, by consequence, destroyed the game's internal integrity from a visual standpoint, and probably even further than that if the relevance of this particular conversation extended to weapon design and functionality as well. It doesn't matter if the expression people might have wanted was possible to accomplish. It obviously was. The point isn't that the choice could always have been made by the developers at any point in history by the nature of TF2 being a live service game. What matters is whether or not that choice should have ever been made. The point is that the choice was always a bad one to make, especially in conjunction with what amplified and essentially incentivizes the art style rot, to the point where we're at now, basically serving as the logical conclusion of the system it introduced, the Manconomy update. So to draw the point back to where it started, what does player expression mean for TF2? At its core, nothing good. Player distinction, though never intended expressly from the mouth of Robin Walker himself, is a fine design principle to stick to if you have to implement something like cosmetics for your game, since it introduces player distinction without corrupting the identity of the game like what player expression would undoubtedly require when pushed to its logical extent. And let me be very clear, the player distinction principle wasn't even adhered to properly in terms of sticking with the game's vibe when hats were first introduced. 4 of the 9 original hats don't fit the art style nor thematic tone of the game. Why would a drunk demolitions man from Scotland be getting a perm for disco night? Why would the pyromaniac, a man described more as a monster within the semi-cartoonish tone of the game's official descriptions, wear a child's beanie? Mind you, this is before Meet the Pyro was released, so an argument can't be made here about it being a meta-reference to that introductory short. Not that such an argument would work in the first place, since meta-references are stupid anyway for the same reason as the banana, it's just dumb. Why would Medic, the natural primary target of the enemy every time he's alive, be wearing an old Prussian war helmet with a spike that gives his position away from behind cover, especially in an environment where snipers exist? Why would Heavy, a Russian, be wearing an American football helmet? The sport didn't even enter the country until 1989, which is 18 years after the latest point the in-game universe can possibly take place in, according to FUNKe.
1971, by the way. That's the latest time TF2 in-game takes place. Oculus Rift was founded in, 2013? A couple years after 1971.
And even with that in mind, the sport didn't even get significant popularity until the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Only 5 out of the 9 hats get an approval rating insofar as adherence to the player distinction standard and the art style as a whole. And that is not a passing grade by any stretch of the imagination. Regardless, I suppose you could say that the fervent attempt was made, and at least they got 5 right. Maybe Valve would learn better in the future, and they kinda did and kinda didn't. After Manconomy, the update that essentially incentivized player expression as a higher priority over player distinction and art style cohesion, the fate of the game's art style in terms of cosmetics was pretty much sealed to permanent calcification. This is the consequence of what FUNKe points out in this pinned comment: abandonment of their own restrictions, if they were even there in the first place. Keep in mind, Manconomy was released on September 30 of 2010. The first community contribution update was released on March 18th of 2010. In that update, there's more items that don't fit the vibe of the game already, so the standard was never there to begin with. At that point, player expression be damned. It doesn't matter what kind of statement people wanted to make about themselves in-game. They could do that someplace else. If it meant destroying the game's art style, it doesn't matter. But alas, it seems that Valve thought that if they could sufficiently deceive the community into believing that the art style of the game was indeed ever-evolving, in spite of the very blatant choice made from release day that proves the contrary, then that would guarantee them enough key sales to make enough money to just keep doing that same thing over and over and over and over and over again. Anyways, FUNKe's main point is that he doesn't walk back on any of his points. He just finds awful loadouts funnier today than he did before. That final part is a walk back of the entire thesis of his video, so I don't know why he'd pretend to still agree with his past words while also expressly stating that he doesn't. This is something pointed out by another notable figure in the TF2 community, and certainly far more relevant of a person as far as current discussions about the game. This profane name. He and FUNKe have a back and forth where Zesty rightly calls out FUNKe's walkback as exactly that. And while he does get terms like player expression wrong and to what extent it applies, his general thoughts are correct. FUNKe responds with fake sentimentality about how the unrestrained level of player expression in TF2 now is fundamentally what makes the game unique. This is obviously untrue, as you can look at plenty of other live service games that forego a cohesive art style in place of unrestrained levels of player expression. I point to the Krobycat video about Call of Duty just as one of many examples. FUNKe makes the critical mistake of fighting Zesty on the basis of complacency, and I say mistake because he fails to define it properly. Zesty previously called him complacent in Valve sacrificing what makes TF2 unique for the sake of player expression, to which FUNKe fires back with a "no, you're complacent," without actually understanding what that means. He says that the lauding of a 20-year-old retired design philosophy is complacent and not progressive, which... oh, gosh. First of all, why does progress matter? Can't something stay one way and be admired for that if it was really good enough to have been looked upon favorably at one point? Second of all, wow, what an insult to the original art team to chalk up their work and care, of which there is quite a substantive amount of documentation regarding, to just retired. If I made that same claim about the art style of something as foundational to FPS games as TF2 is to team games, like, I don't know, Doom or Quake, I'd be publicly hung for the crime of being wrong, and I'd probably deserve it. I mean, there was work put into making TF2 look as distinct as possible at launch, even in spite of being the silly game by comparison to games that had come out around that same time, like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Fear, BioShock, Doom 3, Halo 2, Halo 3, and some of TF2's siblings like Left 4 Dead and Half-Life 2. That's not even naming all of the major first-person shooter games that were released from 2004 to 2009, though those are just some of the ones I can think of off the top of my head right now. And Team Fortress 2 was absolutely distinct among them as an exclusively multiplayer team-based title with an aesthetic not too dissimilar to that of The Incredibles, while also leading very much into the desert setting and character archetypes and stereotypes for each class. Very much a stark contrast to what we have today, again, by your own admission. Thirdly, and probably most stupidly, that's not what complacency means. Complacency is a feeling of self-satisfaction or contentment. So in this case, Zesty used complacency to describe FUNKe's walk-back stance of the art style situation being maybe not that deep. That is a more correct use of the word, but I personally think a better word would have been resigned, as FUNKe still wants to convince people that he isn't walking back against his video. He just wants people to know that he's loosened up a great deal on his standards. Huh, much like Valve there, eh? Jokes aside, that sounds to me like he has resigned himself to accepting the will of Valve, which is not nearly as positive of a connotation to put upon complacency as there realistically should be, but I digress. As far as FUNKe's attempted clapback at Zesty, the word he should have been looking for in this comment is stagnation. What he accuses Zesty of is complacency in a 20-year-old design philosophy, which in this case, as far as Zesty's beliefs are concerned, would be a compliment, since he would, yes, feel content and satisfied with the original design philosophy of the game. That's why he expressed his dissatisfaction of it to FUNKe, and why he also expressed his dissatisfaction with FUNKe's changed stance on the matter. What FUNKe should have said is that Zesty is stagnant, or stale, or static, because the substance of FUNKe's retaliation is to accuse Zesty of not getting with the times. He is the acceptor of the new standard, whereas Zesty is the old boomer yelling at the clouds about kids these days and how things were just better back in his day. What's more is that FUNKe defines progress as the acceptance of beneficial change. This is a really weird thing to say because according to FUNKe even now, he doesn't get bothered by the death of the art style anymore. He just finds it funny. But if we are using the proper definition of progress, which would be change in a positive direction towards a particular end, then what TF2 has experienced since its beginnings has been nothing short of regression, decline, and devolution. That is, change in a negative direction away from the intended end. So when FUNKe says, if anything, the lauding of a 20-year-old retired design philosophy is complacency, not progress, which is the acceptance of beneficial change, and of course substituting complacency for stagnation, because that's absolutely what he means in the context of this conversation, what he's saying is, adhering to the original design principle of the game is stagnation, not progress, which is the acceptance of beneficial change. And yet, by FUNKe's own admission, he doesn't disagree with any core points in his video. He doesn't walk back, meaning that to some extent he still agrees, meaning that 2017 FUNKe and present-day FUNKe are at odds with each other here. Because, by his own admission, What the game is experiencing is not progress. In fact, it is indeed FUNKe himself who is complacent with the state of the game as it stands, because he can't bring himself to condemn the supposed progress, which he proved was active regression of the game's art style back in 2017, in the very video he's commenting under. So, the only question is, which one is it? Because as far as any standard of logic is concerned, FUNKe can't have both here. Well, Zesty responds to clarify his position and express shock at FUNKe's doubling down, while FUNKe clarifies his progress point to being referring to 3 item slots for cosmetic design, which he didn't mention in any of his previous comments, nor in the video itself, so I don't know where he's getting that from. He also says many of the game's best features would be non-existent if Valve had restrained themselves to the production Bible of the game, which, yeah, that would be a good thing, because Valve would be caring enough about the game's internal coherency and consistency to put the work in and do just that. That's not the own FUNKe thinks it is. He also claims it's a bad argument to call acceptance or enjoyment of new features complacency, despite that literally being in line with the definition of the word complacency itself. The lack of self-awareness becomes a headache at this point in the read-through, especially when FUNKe immediately goes on to clarify that he and Zesty both agree on cosmetics being better with themes, which, no, you didn't, because themes can mean anything that is both conducive and not conducive for the game's art style. So it's not just themes that make or break cosmetics. This is intellectually dishonest. In the next sentence, though, FUNKe says he'd rather updates only add sensible stuff, so I guess I'm supposed to ignore that previous sentence. He also finally clarifies his stance outright. He just finds bad loadouts funny. He doesn't think that contradicts anything from his video, which I find amusing because it does. It contradicts his feelings from the video itself, and as a result contradicts several sentiments he held at the time that, when expressed, pointed beyond his subjective understanding of the material he was discussing, and outlined the objective standard that overarches all of this. So, in fact, the sentiment that bad loadouts don't bother him anymore, to the point of him just rolling with it for the sake of a laugh, actually contradicts everything in his video. And to clarify, this would not be a problem if, and only if, his video was based in purely subjective metrics. But he almost never says, "I don't like," in the video, or "this doesn't feel right to me." No, his video expressly outlines the objective standard, even if it was briefly explained. This present-day sentiment runs right up against the very spirit of the original video, and whether he intended the video to point to something into the objective and the realm of truth itself at the time is beside the point. The reality is that it does, regardless of his will, and the video was popular and well-received because of the honesty required to just say it, and point that stuff out to everyone through the use of his large platform. And sure, some of his complaints might have been arbitrary in the moment, but again, regardless of his intent, they pointed to a standard beyond the subjective and into the objective, even into the realm of the truth about the matter, and the core design principles of the game from an artistic standpoint. Now, to remind all of you who are asking, why does this matter, FUNKe is a man with an incredibly popular platform. He has influence in the grand discourse, and he has a much higher chance of affecting the thought process of someone who watches his videos than, say, myself, as a direct result of his popularity. As anyone with such power, if you will, does, he has a responsibility to the truth. He fulfilled that responsibility back in 2017, whether he likes it or not, and now wishes to abdicate that responsibility by saying that his stance has changed. Unfortunately, that's not how things work. There have been forum threads surrounding the statement made on the Knockout forum, the YouTube comments, and even his Twitter response to someone complaining about irreparable damage to cosmetic discussion. No, the irreparable damage is the damage that FUNKe is actively participating in now, by going back on the truth he outlined 9 years ago. What's more is that the side FUNKe now takes in the culture war, if you want to call it that, goes out of their way to stifle discussion about cosmetics and the art style as a whole, because, like I said earlier, the player expression crowd couldn't give less of a care about the art style of any media they interact with, so long as it serves their own, oftentimes shallow, expression. 1960s mercenary warfare in the middle of Nevada be damned. That banana hat will be my expression of goofy, silly, haha video game that I'm playing, and you can't make me see it any other way. And you know what? I don't have to make you see it any other way. I can't make anyone think anything. What I can do, and what I've been doing over the course of this video, is pursue the truth, outline it, and to whomever is willing to understand, show that in no uncertain terms the impact upon a discussion about as important to TF2 as class balance and general functionality is directly influenced by the aristocrats of the internet discourse, primarily being YouTubers like Million Sub Boy FUNKe. If you look at the replies to his pinned comment, there are plenty of defenders of FUNKe's modified position, though thankfully, at least on this one Reddit thread, there are a fair few folks in the top replies that don't buy the new take as legitimate whatsoever, because they understand what I understand. That FUNKe's video pointed to a principle above the subjective, and FUNKe doesn't want to accept that anymore because, well, I don't know why. I guess he just heard that people's feelings were hurt one too many times? I still agree with him. Throughout the years, learning about just how abhorrently detailed and meticulous TF2's visual design is has astounded me. It's like if NASA created a video game. It's incredible and has given me new perspectives on just how much we can influence the human eye. And subsequently seeing all this design being thrown in a dumpster and crapped on after being soaked in acid is heartbreaking. The fact that the art style holds up over all this garbage of gaudy colors, unusuals, bad cosmetics, skins, and so on is a testament to how it should have never happened. Imagine if TF2 stayed pure and fresh in its visual design to this day. It would be so incredibly awesome and make the game so much more relevant. But Valve is lazy, and it doesn't care though. Valve is a multi-millionaire company that still hasn't fixed the bot problem. Valve picks cosmetics and war paints that are low qualities just to shove in the seasonal loot box for money. Look, like what you like, but to see things like Whatville, stock image or AI war paints, or poorly picked cosmetics over the last few years as not clear signs that Valve barely pay attention to this game is crazy. It baffles me that people are going out of their way to fight back against wanting better standards for the game's art style. I get that complaints are annoying and unfun, but the line's gotta be drawn somewhere. This game is going to devolve into some weird Fortnite Roblox hybrid because anytime any complaint comes up, there is significant pushback from its own community. Honestly, I agree with both his video as well as Zesty's. I'm fine with fun and wacky cosmetics, but at the same time there is a certain line that even Valve drew in the sand a long time ago that has now been repeatedly passed, such as limiting cosmetics to the early 80s at the latest, making sure team identification and class identification stays intact, as well as keeping the game in somewhat grounded reality that TF2's goofy story is in. I get we have superhumans from Australia as well as teleporters, sentry guns, and etc., but it had a fairly distinct look, and it should stay that way as closely as possible. I mean, I don't expect Red Dead Redemption to have these weird earbuds for customization that weren't made till years after the game's time period and stuff. Why would I expect it from TF2? Even war paints and stuff have been coming out better lately, with people hounding on quality over quantity. So as much as people like to fight against him or other content creators who say otherwise, I do think Zesty and FUNKe's original videos and streams are doing more good for the game now than like Soundsmith using the weird dog cosmetics to come out last year for a clickbait mug root beer unboxing video that actually ended up being extremely popular. It's still good to know that some folks out there are still disillusioned enough to see things the way they are. Not FUNKe, though. In fact, I edited a piece of one of my recent live streams together for my alt channel, describing my thoughts on the video because Richter recommended it to me, and I thought, sure, why not? I even added FUNKe in the video because A, it's a much easier way to give credit to the original creators, but also B, I didn't actually think he'd care enough to respond, so I did it more so as a joke for myself. Foolish me, though, he did respond, and I'm sorry to say, it's just more of the same. I don't need to get into the comment here, as I have already written a sufficiently lengthy reply to him outlining thoughts I would just be repeating here. What I will admit, though, is that I did come on a little bit too hard. Not too terribly hard, I think, but just a little, and I accept the consequences of that. I won't delete it or edit it, as I want the core points to remain there as they are, and my points do indeed still stand. This video has been an illustration of those points, namely that FUNKe's influence on the conversation does matter a lot more than he thinks it does, that FUNKe's revised stance is fundamentally wrong, to such an extent that his own points can be contradicted by that video, and while he still wants to say he doesn't necessarily disagree with his own video, he also kinda does disagree with his own video. And if FUNKe is watching this video, you are partially correct in that part of my issue with your revised stance is that it seems less invested and that you're undercrediting your original video's point. From your perspective, you claim that all you're backpedaling on is the tone of your video. However, as outlined in this video, and as alluded to in my replies to you, the problem is not your video's tone. In fact, your tone is what should be the norm for this kind of situation. Your video's tone is the baseline, the tutorial for tone, if you want to put it that way. Whether you believe that or not, whether you can bring yourself to accept that or not, that doesn't matter to me, and it doesn't matter to the discussion at large, because that is just the fact of the matter. That is not just my overzealous 10 years younger opinion. No, the problem is that if you want me to believe that all you have an issue with is the video's tone, why use the vocabulary that you did with Zesty in your replies? Why use the words you did in that Knockout forum post and that Twitter reply? As this video has proven, you have a lot more of an issue with the discussion your video inspired than merely the tone you popularized said discussion with. You have a problem with people taking this discussion as seriously as they do. You have a problem that folks look to your video for inspiration on the matter when you yourself seem to think it was too mean, or perhaps not well researched, or perhaps too spur of the moment. You have a problem that you point to a standard that seems to be beyond your own understanding. The problem is that you don't like being held accountable to what you said back in the day. The problem is that you don't like it when people compare and contrast your previous arguments to your present-day ones and think to themselves, well, this can't be right, this past argument is more right, so I'm sticking with this one. The problem is that you think folks that care enough to look back fondly on the game's original art style, to such an extent that, eccentric though they may be, they demand better for the game, are nothing more than stagnant and a drag on supposed progress. Unless, of course, that applies only to Zesty, in which case I would ask why you would only use certain vocabulary around him and not others. Is it for the same reason so many others hate him? Because he's the most basic example of leaning right of center on social matters that have nothing to do with the video game? The problem is that you don't want to recognize that, in spite of how you may feel about your video, you tapped into a matter of truth that genuinely means something. Enough that the piles of documentation regarding the care the original art team took to make TF2 look the way it did back in 2007 are still held to the highest of regard throughout the gaming industry. The problem is that you say that you still agree with the core, but can't bring yourself to say it with the substance it requires. The problem is that the most people can get from you now about this is a remark about how you find certain looks objectively funny, in spite of distinguishing your subjective taste and humor and the objective health of the game. The problem is that in spite of recognizing that distinction, you host games that expressly exploit the destruction you claimed was a bad thing. Could you have done better with that video back in 2017 with all the metrics you mentioned to me? Absolutely. My point is that you didn't have to, and the problem is that you just don't want to agree. Why? I don't know, but you just don't, and that leads people to see you as intellectually dishonest. If you don't like that, you should probably consider brushing up on your vocabulary, since there is not a snowball's chance in hell that you genuinely expect people like me to believe that you are well-intentioned and consistent with yourself when I have pointed to examples of you being the very opposite of consistent, good intentions be damned. The real problem, FUNKe? You have no standards, and that removes your voice from the relevance of the conversation about what is genuinely beneficial for the game. If you can't bring yourself to plant your flag somewhere firm, somewhere that can stand up to scrutiny, and somewhere that is worth taking a stand on, like I dare to do with this video, then as respectfully as I can possibly put this, though I'm sure that doesn't matter to you now, you don't belong in this game's culture. Lock in or get out. The reality is that if people really do want to say they care about TF2, then standards need to get higher and fast. Action must be taken to preserving some semblance of the game's core, be it through highly curated community servers, source mods, or whatever else people can think of. If we want to actually say that we care about the game, mean that, and actually have that be true, there's going to have to be a lot more effort involved to preserving what makes this game the subject of tons upon tons of lambasting people who care as nostalgia-addled, rose-tinted sunglasses-wearing freak shows that just got a bit too much of that '07 nostalgia to blind them from the truth. And just in case anyone slings those kinds of insults my way, the truth about me is that I was born in '05, and I didn't start playing this game until late 2022. Even then, I played a lot of source mods that took far more care in the art style they wished to deliver at the time than TF2 did, which was a major contributor of why I left TF2. Why I'm back is to be one of the hopefully many voices that need to start getting loud about their care to an unabashed level. Otherwise, standards among the community will continue to dwindle until we might as well be hoping and praying for something like a banana to be back in TF2 compared to whatever else we get in that bleak potential future. So again, I say, to all who are watching now, lock in or get out. Sincerely, some random who just so happens to care. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So, in fact, the sentiment that bad outloads